Jamel, it's clear, I think, that this time is a little different. We're taking a look at some pictures now from, I believe, Fredericksburg, Virginia. Do I have that right? Fredericksburg, Virginia, where protesters are blocking one of the highways there. Jamel, I think there's an article from the New York Times from Jenna Wortham that I'd love to get your thoughts on. And she wrote about the impact of COVID-19 kind of adding what she described as its own accelerant to the mix. How might this look, Jamel, if we were not going through a pandemic? It seems like COVID-19 exposed some of the issues and the inequalities that have also come up as a result of these protests.
Well, it not only exposed a lot of the inequity that we have in our country, but I think it also forced us to slow down and have time to think. You know, many of us are working from home. We're not distracted by other things. And now we're finally forced to deal with a lot of the problems, a lot of the systemic issues, the oppression, the things that have been slowly and for hundreds of years eating at the core of this country. But we don't have anywhere to run. We can't use work as a distraction. We can't use sports as a distraction. We can't use a lot of different things as distractions that constantly have us saying, well, maybe later, not now. Now isn't the time. Well, considering we're all in a crisis, a medical crisis, a public health crisis, there may be no other time better than this one. So I think that's why right now people are willing to sit in this a little bit, whereas in other various points where we've seen this kind of police brutality inflicted on Black people, we have rushed to get past the discomfort. This time, we're literally living in it.
And a quick correction, sorry, these images are not from Fredericksburg. They're from Frederick, Maryland, which is northwest of Washington. Wow. It's an outer suburb, an exurb kind of near the Washington-Baltimore region. Janelle, let me ask you, Janelle Ross, about the generational divide here. Do you notice a difference between the way that older people of color and younger people of color have responded to this moment, either in the protests, in the advocacy, anything like that?
I think to a degree, I think there is some degree of disagreement about the importance of how one protests and how those protests appear to others. And I think without wanting to overgeneralize, I think that there is some more pronounced concern among older people about making sure that protesters appear to be peaceable and respectful of authority and the sort of appearance of law and order. But that isn't to say that young people are not concerned about that at all. I don't think that there is so much of a massive divide between generations so much as there is I think a sense of long-term knowledge about how this country tends to respond and different notions because of life experience about what works.
When you say different notions about what works, elaborate on that a little bit.
I think that there are really, really strong feelings among people who were personally involved in the civil rights movement in the mid part of the 20th century, that nonviolent protest is the only way and the only method that has worked. And then I think for younger people who were not personally alive to participate in the mid 20th century civil rights movement, there is the stretch of history that they've only read about, but of course some full knowledge that what came out of the civil rights movement certainly were many policies that are really central to Black life and welfare in America today. But also there were limitations in terms of what was accomplished. And I think that people who were not personally there and didn't have to put themselves personally on the line, it's a little easier to step back and look at those things critically and maybe even sometimes criticize them. But again, I really don't want to overstate that, because that is not something that I would say that I had a grand sense that there was some grand divide that had developed, that has
changes like these. They'll change how protesters deal with police in some cities. Then again, the ones we mentioned are temporary, a review period, a restraining order. What do you make of them on balance?
I think they clearly showed that policymakers and officials are feeling the pressure of the sustained and protests and the scope of the protests. And I think they're far from enough. We have been in a period of policy change now for decades. There have been commission after commission after commission, inquiry after inquiry, investigation after investigation. I myself testified in front of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. I think we've reached a point where we recognize that those policies are not effective. And I think, frankly, those policy changes are quite minor and out of step with the demands that are being made by dozens of groups on the ground, including the folks in LA that we just heard from, and by the Movement for Black Lives nationally, to actually defund the police and actually reduce the opportunities for police to come into contact with people and use a chokehold.
As we keep an eye on these images out of Frederick, Maryland, there have been rolling protests through the day. Professor, let me note this tidbit from Vox. They have been looking at the way that activists have affected the national media landscape, the way that news organizations like ours are covering events like this. And among other things, the article asserts incidents of violence aren't increasing, we just hear about them more. Do you see the shift in coverage, the evolution in coverage, as a good thing?
Absolutely, Joshua. I think one of the things that I love to study is the impact that African-American witnesses have made throughout history and how that impact is being accelerated. In the book, I talk about 3 overlapping eras of domestic terror against Black people. From slavery, which has led to lynching, which then led to what we have now, police brutality. And in each of those eras, we've had Black witnesses use the technology of their days to bear witness to what they saw. It's only fitting that last month, Ida B. Wells, one of the foremost witnesses to lynching in her day, posthumously won a Pulitzer Prize. I'm sure she's rejoicing right now because in her lifetime, she was never able to see anti-lynching legislation passed. So as we talk about policy and the impact that witnesses, Black witnesses, have had, we've always moved the needle forward using journalism as the key tool to do that. The shift that I see right now, though, is that citizen journalists on the ground are highlighting some things that we may not have known before. For instance, many of these are peaceful protests and that the violence is agitated, in fact, by police. That's not something that we would have seen here in LA, where I'm based, during 1992, during coverage of the Rodney King uprisings that were here. As recently as 2014, that's not what was reported in Ferguson. So the media have come an incredibly long way in showing that these protests really run the gamut and that most people out here in 50 states in more than 20 different countries are peacefully protesting what has needed to change for a very long time.
Professor Alyssa Richardson and Andrea Ritchie, glad to have had you both with us. Thanks very much.
Glad to have had you both with us.
You are looking at live crowds in Frederick, Maryland, blocking traffic on one of the main thoroughfares there. Much more to see this evening. On your left, looks like a map of part of Brooklyn. Protests all over the country, but next we're going to Louisville, Kentucky. That is where a vigil is being held for Breonna.